Okay, so one last video lecture that I want to include in our discussion of the things they carried. And I want to acknowledge the fact that there are a lot of sort of critical articles on the things they carried that critique the stories in the collection as perpetuating certain masculinist ideas, certain ideas about manhood. So I want to address those, and I also want to talk a little bit about sort of how the text both challenges and reinforces certain ideas about gender. So let's focus on the good things first. Where Tim O'Brien's stories succeed in challenging our sort of ideas or ideals or gender stereotypes. So in regards to masculinity, we've talked about a couple of things that he's done in the stories. Um, he really sort of acknowledges the social, cultural, family, the pressures on young boys and men to sort of live up to an unrealistic ideal, um, and to teach young boys to emulate and put on a pedestal uh, heroes, warriors, macho type of men that he's seen depicted in television and film in Hollywood. And then we see the stark reality is that, war is not a place to be a hero. It is really a place of horror and suffering. So that ideal, that fantasy is shattered, and all of the men are wounded in some way or another. So he's really blowing apart that fantasy, that sort of masculine fantasy of becoming a war hero, and glorifying or seeing one's name in glory and achieving greatness, being a war hero. He really sort of takes the wind out of that sails of that fantasy. Another thing that he does in terms of challenging gender stereotypes, he shows that the men are not just sort of uh, two-dimensional warrior archetypes. It's not like a John Wayne or a Lone Ranger. These flat sort of archetypal images of a warrior, a male warrior, or male soldier, or male hero. In reality, these are human beings, and they're depicted as, having feelings, being imperfect. Um, they make mistakes. They're, everyday, normal human beings who are flawed, right? So I think in a way he gives life to what could quickly turn into just a caricature of a soldier. He sort of develops each character and helps the reader sort of feel sympathy and see that their, vulnerability as young men. So he succeeds in making these characters human and portraying them in a sort of authentic way where we understand the emotional um, sort of the emotional side of each of those characters, and even showing men with emotions is would have been something quite change a change in the representation of war narratives too. So by sort of displaying men in their vulnerability would have been a little bit more cutting edge when this book was originally published. So he is doing something in terms of questioning or challenging that stoic masculine warrior. Another good thing, so yeah, he shows the fact that beneath that tough guy's exterior, that these men are sensitive, caring. Um, they're not just weapons of war, they're not just the tools or cogs in a machine. the way that, the military system can sort of turn these men, dehumanize them, make them into sort of killing machines. He sort of shows the human side of the soldier. And he also acknowledges how a lot of the the bravado, the macho-ness of it is all a sort of facade, right? So he talked about the underlying fear, the tough guys, right? The facade of masculinity. Buried beneath that is, uh, you know, vulnerability, fear, and just being afraid of being humiliated or being viewed as a coward. So there's that, again, the cultural expectations of living up to one's manhood or one's being macho is sort of a burden on these young men rather than something positive in their lives. But where some feminist critics have pointed out in these stories, women are sort of not present as strong, active subjects. They're really separated. And in the case of, there's Martha, there's his daughter Kathleen, there's Mary Ann. So all these characters, excluding Mary Ann, who sort of immersed herself in the war in Sweetheart of the Song Trabong. In that story, Mary Ann comes over, the girlfriend of one of the men, and she completely sort of immerses herself in the war experience. But other than that character, all the other women seem to not understand, not take the time to sort of listen to, or they can't really fully grasp the Vietnam War experience. And there's kind of a separation between men and women, masculinity and femininity that some critics say Tim O'Brien doesn't do enough to show how these two gender ideas are not divided in such stark ways. For example, women were involved in the Vietnam War as nurses, predominantly as nurses. On the Viet Cong side, women were part of the army in some cases. So the roles that women played are a lot more involved than, I guess, Tim O'Brien's depictions suggest. And critics also talk about that one story with Mary Ann as being, it seems almost like it could be a feminist story where we have this all-American girl sort of giving up all the gender conventions and becoming this violent um, uh, Green Beret type. So she takes up the whole military spirit and immerses herself in that culture. You could see that as a kind of feminist, freeing herself, liberating herself from all those gender conventions of the 1960s. However, critics have also said that the treatment of that character in that story, it sees her defiance of gender as something gross or something repulsive or something horrifying rather than something uh, more positive or liberating. So her that the feminist aspect of that story is sort of lost in this telling of it. And the last point is, if you're interested in the depiction of women, there are a couple of critics. Laurie Smith wrote an interesting article on Tim O'Brien's short stories, and she argues that Tim O'Brien doesn't do enough in his critique of his character's misogyny. And we saw that instance when the word coos, a dumb coos, was used in How to Tell a True War Story. So that would be an example of sort of blatant misogyny that is not critiqued. And the artificial binary opposition of masculinity and femininity, which we've talked about. The fact that there's very few female characters that can fully understand or stop to listen or can grasp the reality of what men do in war. So there's no empathy or bond between men and women. These are sort of separated. And there's no redefinition of power, no fissure in the patriarchal discourse of war. So critics like Laurie Smith argue that he just doesn't do enough to question the sort of male dominance of war narratives. So there's not enough active female subjectivity, not enough challenging or breaking down those ingrained gender roles. And yeah, the importance of the homosocial bond between men is never really fully challenged in any direct way. So you do get a sense that it's the male relationships of the soldiers themselves that are the bonds that are, integral or most central in the storytelling. The final story does sort of attempt to reconcile masculinity and femininity in a little bit more direct way when he compares, the death of his friend Linda when she was just 9 years old, and she had cancer. So he also talks about how important this relationship was in his life, a friendship with this childhood friend who died. And he says, through storytelling, he's able to keep that relationship alive, and as well as the lost lives of his fellow soldiers. So whether or not you agree with this assessment of Tim O'Brien's depiction of gender is up to you, but I just wanted to acknowledge that there are, critiques of his depiction of femininity and female characters. So it is something to think about. I know we're kind of focusing solely on masculinity, but there are some interesting things to say about the women or a lack of strong female feminine characters in the stories as well. So just something to think about.